thank you all for coming. A great turnout for a great subject, and particularly a great panel. And I'm not going to waste any time doing long introductions, since you all know who Chas Freeman is and was, and you all know Dennis's sterling CV, and I'm not going to repeat it in any detail, just for the record that Chas was at one point an ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Dennis has worked with at least 4 presidents on Middle East issues, and I can't think of 2 better people to address a very fundamental question, which is the death of Khashoggi, which we've all been talking about, is it a game changer, as some have suggested, or will it be put under the rug and we will move on with business as usual? I have no idea what Chas or Dennis think about this matter. We will now hear. Chas will go first. He'll 15 minutes or so, and then Dennis, and then we will open up for questions. The only stipulation on the question is that you wait for the microphone to come to you and you state where you are from. Other than that, let us start. Chas, you're up.
Well, this is a very sad subject. We're only beginning to understand the slowly unfolding impact of Jamal Khashoggi's murder. He was a friend of 30 years, and no one deserves to die in the way that he apparently did. The incident is in every respect repellent. The operation that felled Jamal seems to have been intended to silence a critic of some aspects of Saudi domestic and foreign policy. It must surely have succeeded in intimidating other Saudis from speaking out, but justifiably or not, it has raised questions about the kingdom's rulers' abilities to exercise wise control of Saudi agencies and officers. It has emboldened Saudi Arabia's foreign critics, alarmed its potential foreign investors, and contributed to international pressure on the kingdom to end its blockade of Qatar and war in Yemen. It's handed Turkey a full deck of cards to play against the kingdom's preeminent position in both the Dar al-Islam and the Arab Gulf. Ankara seeks to prolong the erosion of Saudi credibility and bolster its own by revealing its hand just 1 or 2 cards at a time. Murder has embarrassed the kingdom's friends and stimulated renewed attacks on it by its foreign enemies and critics. Ironically, Jamal, who loved his homeland and approved of much, though not all, of the change its newest rulers had brought to it, would have been appalled by the damage his death is doing to Saudi Arabia's reputation and the difficulties this is creating for its continuing betterment. Jamal supported the kingdom's traditional Islamic constitutional practices. Despite caricatures to the contrary abroad, these precluded capricious one-man rule. The king felt obliged to consult with many others, other lineages of the family, prominent merchant families, noted religious scholars, and experts to verify a consensus that he could proclaim as a decision. He did not decide unilaterally. This system provided ample checks and balances against rash decisions. It also held the king accountable and enabled his removal from the throne if his peers in the family judged him to be misgoverning. In 1964, the family forced the abdication of King Saud on these grounds. The Saudi system exemplified the Islamic concept of shura, or consultative governance. This made Saudi Arabia very boring. It also made the kingdom a largely trouble-free protectorate and entente partner of the United States. I I'll just interject here that I'm sick and tired of hearing every relationship we have described as an alliance. That word has a special meaning. An entente is a limited partnership for a limited purpose, often for a limited time. It's what we had with the Soviet Union in World War II, not an alliance. Our two countries, that is Saudi Arabia and the United States, interests rarely clashed. The Ramadan or Yom Kippur War of 1973 is the exception that proves the rule. The Saudis then did not hesitate to stand by their interests as they saw them and to organize OPEC to punish the United States for its decisive support of Israel against Egypt. The kingdom has always had the power to act on its own and against U.S. interests when it feels it must. Jamal Khashoggi's targeted killing reflects the modern, not the ancient Middle East. This is a region in which systematic violations of both decency and international law have produced a Hobbesian anarchy. Israel has set a potent negative example for others by ignoring the rules of the liberal, rule-based international order espoused by the United States for most of the 20th century. It has used assassination as a frequent tool against its captive Arab population and the Palestinian diaspora in the Levant, Europe, and North Africa, as well as against Iran, of course. It has practiced and sought to legitimize preemptive warfare, which had been outlawed by the UN Charter. Israel has exploited its U.S. guaranteed military supremacy over its neighbors in repeated attempts to terrorize them into docility. There had been no real Saudi precedent for similar policies and operations. Now, with a Saudi generation in charge that openly admires Israeli ruthlessness, there is. In recent years, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE have found compelling reasons to cooperate against Iran. The various elements of the Israel lobby have coordinated with Saudi and Emirati hired lobbyists to bring about the Trump administration's repudiation of the Iran nuclear deal and to reimpose unilateral U.S. sanctions on Iran today. Despite the notorious venality of the U.S. Congress, this is the result the Saudis and Emiratis could not have achieved on their own. Israel and Saudi Arabia also, notably, have now got an openly declared intelligence liaison relationship that apparently includes training for parallel or even joint operations against Iran. Whoever authorized it, Jamal Khashoggi's murder, marks a deplorable innovation in Saudi cross-border operations. Someone in the kingdom has just done what the United States accuses Iran of doing, assassinating dissidents to suppress criticism and neutralize dissent. If the murder was an accident, it was a remarkably carefully prepared one. The manner of it suggests that Mossad trained the special unit of the Royal Guard that carried it out. That novice unit bungled the wet work, as Mossad, with all of its experience in assassinations, would not have done. The Saudi war in Yemen is also correctly viewed as an Arabian copy of Israel's campaigns to immiserate Gaza into paralysis. The United States provides critical material support for the ongoing wars in Yemen and against Gaza. It shields the Saudis and Israelis from investigation by the international community of the war crimes both visibly commit. The U.S. is a co-belligerent in both wars. I'm not sure who authorized that. Saudi Arabia pays for U.S. support. Israel extracts American subsidies for its military operations. In both countries, wars on neighbors feed nationalist sentiment and rally the people behind their leaders. But these wars trouble Saudi Arabia's and Israel's constituencies in the United States and are eroding their support here. In the past, those foreigners familiar with Saudi Arabia and fond of it, and there are not many of us, have been confident that the kingdom would continue to live up to its reputation as a conservative, consensus-oriented, and stable place. The Khashoggi affair has raised questions abroad about decision-making in Riyadh and the effectiveness of royal supervision of the state. If a murder apparently conducted to punish lèse majesté, the criminal offense against the dignity of a ruler, was not a rogue operation. What does this say about the self-discipline and wisdom of Saudi decision makers? If it was a rogue operation, what does that say about the ability of the king and crown prince to control the actions of subordinates? The sooner these questions are clarified, the better. The attempted cover-up has undermined Saudi credibility across the board. The kingdom must now work to restore the honor of its word. Despite apparent fissures in the royal family, King Salman and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman can be confident that their kin will stand with them on this matter. I note that Prince Ahmed bin Abdulaziz, the heir to the throne in the older generation, is now back in Riyadh after residing in London and saying things that disturb people in his own family. Every member of the Al Saud knows that squabbling in the family was what brought down the two previous Al Saud dynasties. All remember the fall of the Shah in Iran. All understand the imperative of unity behind the throne. MBS, as the Crown Prince is known in English, has consistently had very strong support from most of the Saudi populace, 2/3 of which is under 30. Foreign condemnation of the Khashoggi affair has not changed this. It has instead aroused Saudi nationalism in support of the monarchy and the Crown Prince in particular. Within the kingdom, it has rallied support, as I said. It has recommitted the king to his favorite son, while setting aside earlier speculation about his possible plans to abdicate to allow MBS to succeed him. If there is now a threat to Saudi stability, it originates mainly, though not entirely, abroad, not in the kingdom. When President Trump took office, he immediately set aside diplomacy as his preferred method of advancing U.S. interests abroad and replaced it with personal ingratiation of foreign leaders by himself and members of his family. Uncertainties about how the Khashoggi affair might affect the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia now illustrate the problems with putting all one's eggs in a single foreign personality's basket. Israel and the Trump administration have, in fact, placed huge bets on MBS's ability to help them deliver regime change in Iran, the Palestinian capitulation to Israel, and the moderation of puritanical strains of Islam. Some in the United States are already engaged in campaigns to stop the war in Yemen and the blockade of Qatar, dissociate the U.S. from Saudi Arabia, and pursue normalization with Iran. They have, not surprisingly, seized on the Khashoggi murder to advance these agendas. Within the Islamic world, Turkey, as I said earlier, is using the incident to prosecute the cause of democratic Islamism and the Muslim Brotherhood against traditional Arab forms of governance. It's dribbling out evidence to gain leverage over the kingdom in the matter of its blockade of Qatar and covert action in Syria. Iran is quietly using the Khashoggi murder to divert attention from its own similar activities and to further its campaign to vilify Saudi intolerance as the font of all Islamist terrorism. Arab intellectuals in the Levant have long resented Saudi Arabia's wealth and sanctimony. They and the Arab diaspora in the West have seized on the incident to condemn the kingdom's leadership as depraved and morally unfit to control the Muslim holy places. In short, everyone is now hurling pet rocks at the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. In the process, important American national interests are being slighted. The United States is once again a significant exporter of oil and natural gas. Americans do not ourselves depend on imports of energy from Saudi Arabia, but aided by its leadership of OPEC and partnership with Russia, the kingdom retains the ability to affect the global economy in ways that deeply affect U.S. prosperity. Recent efforts by the Trump administration to talk down oil prices in advance of the U.S. midterms underscore the continuing power of the kingdom in world energy markets. Since the U.S. invaded Iraq against Saudi advice in in 2003, Saudi Arabia has adopted political military policies independent of the United States. Rather than counting on the U.S. to defend it, the kingdom has turned to self-strengthening through huge arms purchases and technology transfers from the U.S., Europe, China, and Russia. Part of MBS's pitch to President Trump was his undertaking to reinstate a preference for buying American arms. This was good news for the U.S. defense industrial base. Saudi Arabia is the largest single foreign purchaser of U.S. defense equipment and services. Many production lines would shut down here if the kingdom bought elsewhere. Sanctions on the export of U.S. weapons and surveillance equipment to the kingdom would hand its market to established foreign competitors, and Israel would be happy to sell the kingdom all the surveillance and police equipment it might want. Saudi Arabia sits on one of the world's most vital strategic lines of communication. The U.S. ability to project power to West Asia and around the globe hinges on the ability to overfly Saudi territory. The Saudis can approve or deny overflight to reflect their level of satisfaction with U.S. support for them. Saudi Arabia is a huge market for U.S. civilian goods and services. It prices oil in dollars rather than in other currencies. This is a deliberate decision that is not inevitably to last. The Saudis have historically been important financiers of U.S. foreign policy. Their support of the dollar, obviously, is a major contribution to U.S. global power. The human intelligence Saudi Arabia provides against Islamist terrorism is essentially irreplaceable. America is no longer the unrivaled external power in the Middle East. It needs Saudi Arabia as a partner to restore a stable balance of power in the Persian Gulf, to deal with Iran, to address the Israel-Palestine issue, to avoid ceding the region to Russia or other global competitors, and to neutralize fervent anti-Americanism among the world's Muslims. The United States goes out of its way to retain a cooperative relationship with Israel, despite its frequent violations of international norms and American values. Similarly, it would not serve U.S. interests to allow moral indignation to overwhelm consideration of everything else at stake in relations with Saudi Arabia. Washington should therefore, or should instead, rather than throwing up its hands and pitching bet rocks at Saudi Arabia, Washington should instead help Saudi Arabia to fix the internal control problems that enabled its criminal plunder in Istanbul, not rub salt in its wounds. It should encourage MBS to continue the long overdue social and economic reforms he has launched. It should use America's leverage to enable the kingdom to extricate itself honorably from Yemen and to compose its relations with Turkey and Qatar. A rift in U.S.-Saudi relations would, of course, not threaten the existence of either the United States of America or the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But it would have grave consequences for the peace and well-being of both, and for their allies and friends. Surtout pas trop de zèle. We need cool heads and an eye to the future as we try to sort out the mess left by the brutal murder of my friend, Jamal Khashoggi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chaz. As usual, succinct, provocative, and on the ball. Lots of questions, I'm certain. Dennis.
So, I have to say that I agree with a lot of what Chaz said. I certainly agree with his description of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, someone who I also knew. I find it's something that so brutally crossed the line of being unacceptable that it is hard in some ways to fathom. If it was by design to silence critics, the fact that there's a level of just almost stupidity that is hard to completely fathom. For among other reasons, I mean, taking a step in Turkey and to think that Turkey wouldn't exploit this is pretty remarkable in and of itself. and that I don't mean to diminish the gravity of what was done, but I'm trying to highlight why it's hard to comprehend what was done, and what Chaz said, which I also completely agree with. It's done great damage to Saudi Arabia's reputation, and it has served the interests of those who are determined and are Saudi adversaries. I also think something else that Chaz said. This has not weakened MBS. You are seeing a kind of nationalist reaction within Saudi Arabia in support of him. And there is, Chaz put it one way, I'll put it somewhat differently, but it means the same thing. I've long felt that the Saudi royal family has operated on the Benjamin Franklin adage that we'll all hang separately unless we hang together. And so you are seeing, I think, even if there is unhappiness within parts of the royal family with him, for sure there is. I don't see a weakening of his position at this point. There's only one person who could really affect MBS's position, and that's the king at this point, and I don't see much sign of that. I will say I don't see the Israelis as being the source of Saudi behavior, which seemed to be one of the implications of what Chaz was saying. I think if you want to look at what may have motivated behavior that crosses all lines, we're living in an era where global norms don't seem to count for much. So the Russians can go ahead and poison somebody who's a former agent in the UK. The Chinese can grab the Chinese head of Interpol. Iran can carry out attempted assassinations in Paris and in Denmark. So I think, if there's sources of inspiration for the Saudis, they probably have all sorts of different places, or at least for MBS, there are probably all sorts of different places where they could look. I do think the real issue is, what does the Trump administration do now? On the one hand, we've had the president say this is the worst cover-up in history. We've also had him say that there's going to be a severe price that will be paid, and yet at the same time, the administration does look to want to preserve what is the U.S.-Saudi relationship, because it does recognize what it sees are basic interests that the United States has in that relationship. From this administration standpoint, certainly the president has talked about arms sales, the great value of arms sales. I think also the commercial business relationships are an important part of this administration's calculus. But there are several other factors as well. The administration is rolling out the next phase, phase 2 of sanctions on Monday, vis-a-vis Iran. It sees the Saudis as being an important part of its counter-Iranian strategy. It certainly sees the Saudis, and Chaz made a reference to this, it certainly sees the Saudis helping to be the balancer in the oil market, helping to ensure that prices, if in fact the sale of Iranian oil drops beyond where it has, by the way, it's already dropped about 1 million barrels a day, simply because of the anticipation of this round of sanctions that is coming. So as part of the counter-Iranian strategy, as part of the need to ensure that the oil market stays within balance, there certainly is a sensitivity to that on the part of the administration. It has looked to the Saudis as part of its counter-ISIS strategy, not only in terms of countering the ideology, which has been a part of the MBS agenda, but also because it looks in those areas that were liberated in Syria, it looks at Saudis for funding reconstruction, since the administration itself is not in the business of funding such reconstruction. There seems to be a recognition that if you leave a complete vacuum there, you're also, in a sense, laying the seeds of son of ISIS emerging over time. Saudis, not long after the killing of Khashoggi, after having not provided $100 billion that they had promised the administration, did provide that $100 million. So there's a wide array of different things that matter to the administration, and the one that I haven't mentioned yet is, which is frequently talked about, is the Trump peace plan. And I'll take a minute to talk about that, just because I think we haven't seen it unveiled yet. I suspect at some point we will see it unveiled. There was, I think, an exaggerated expectation on the part of the administration of what role the Saudis could play in this, and particularly what role MBS would play in this. When the administration came in, it seemed to subscribe to this notion of an outside-in approach. The outside-in was that you could get the Arab leaders, the Sunni Arab leaders, who have converging interests with the Israelis when it comes to countering Iran and when it comes to even countering ISIS, that given that convergence of interest, given tacit cooperation below the radar screen, that they would play a different kind of role on peace, and they would, in a sense, if not take the place of the Palestinians, they could deliver the Palestinians. This notion that they could either take the place of the Palestinians or deliver the Palestinians was always unrealistic. And I do think what's happened over time is the administration has scaled back its expectations, appropriately so. What is, I think, possible is that you could get the Sunni Arab leaders with, and it can't be only the Saudis, it has to be the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Moroccans. They could, I think, realistically say, assuming the plan is credible, and I'll explain that in a second, assuming the plan is credible, they could say we have questions about the plan, but we think it's a serious basis for negotiations. That's the maximum. You won't get more than that. And even to get that, actually the plan has to be credible, meaning it would have to provide for a Palestinian state within what would be seen as viable borders, and it would have to provide for a capital for that state in Arab East Jerusalem. If it doesn't have that, then you're not going to get Arab leaders, Sunni Arab leaders, to say even what I just described. Even then, it'll have to be presented to them privately, and there'll have to be discussions. You'll have to work out what's said. So there's a lot of work that would still need to be done. But what it reflects is, again, part of a panoply of different interests that the administration sees as being at stake, and therefore why they want to manage the fallout from the killing of Khashoggi. Now, there are, in addition, as I said, the transformation of Saudi Arabia that MBS is presiding over, has made his mission, happens to be in our interest as well. Discrediting an extremist ideology that was also exported and became the basis in many ways of what we had to fight with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, is very much in our interest. Having an approach that reconciles Islam with modernity happens to be in our interest. Creating a successful model of development in the Arab world, especially for larger Arab states, is very much in our interest, because the absence of that has also been something that secular nationalists who are radical and the Islamists have tried to exploit. So all those things are in our interest. But so is preserving certain global norms. The idea that it's okay to go out and be assassinating people is something that should not be seen as acceptable, and we should be acting to make it clear it's not acceptable. What the Khashoggi killing represents is something that, from our standpoint, we have to prove somehow is intolerable, not just with our words, but I think also with our actions. So what does that lead you to do? What should the administration be doing vis-a-vis the Saudis now? Well, I would outline a number of things that I think would be driven by the following purpose. The purpose is not to punish the Saudis for the sake of punishing. The purpose should be to exact a price to demonstrate there's a consequence for this kind of behavior, so that in fact the behavior changes. So that in fact the behavior becomes, I would say, more tempered and careful. And so some of the mistaken steps that we've seen taken, some of the mistaken policies that we've seen over time, become corrected. So what does that mean? Well, for one thing, Saudis should get their story straight. And they ought to answer certain questions. You know, it's, why were 15 people sent? Why was there a forensic doctor part of this group? Secondly, they ought to, if they're prosecuting these 18 people, then the trials ought to be open enough that international observers can be there to show they're not hiding anything. Thirdly, I think the administration needs to make it clear privately to the Saudis, to the king and to MBS, that we will from now on be much louder when it comes to reacting to what they do to dissidents. That needs to be part of the landscape. Fourthly, I would like to see us suspend at least certain offensive weapons that have been used to such terrible effect within Yemen. At the same time, when I say that, I wouldn't be undercutting our commitment to Saudi security, because that also happens to be in our interest. At the same time, I would actually increase what we're providing them when it comes to protecting against Houthi missiles. There are increasing signs, by the way, that the Iranians have not only provided these, but they're now, with Hezbollah, have been working on helping the Houthis to be able to begin to manufacture them on their own. So I think we need to be doing more in the area of anti-missile missile. It's not just PAC-2 missiles I'd be providing. I think we should be doing more with that. I think we should be doing more with counter battery. I think we should be doing more with defenses for Saudi borders. I would couple the suspension of some of the offensive weaponry with what is a commitment to demonstrate that we mean what we say about standing by Saudi security. I think the announcement by Mattis and Pompeo on the need for a ceasefire in Yemen was good. They did make it dependent on the Houthis stopping to fire first. I would actually say it would be in Saudi interest right now for the Saudis to go ahead and declare, all right, we're going to adopt a ceasefire. Make it for a period of time. Maybe it's for a week. Maybe it's 2 weeks. Maybe it's, I don't know, 10 days to 2 weeks. And make it clear that they're not firing at any point. If the Houthis continue, then it becomes clear that this is, in fact, something that is being driven by the Houthis and the Iranians. The Iranians clearly have an interest. The Iranians see Yemen as a great place to bleed Saudi Arabia. And I suspect that in the aftermath of this next round of sanctions, we will see the Iranians try to ratchet up pressure in the region as a way of saying, okay, you put pressure on us, we can put pressure on your friends and your interests. I suspect there'll be more of that. But I think the Saudis, given the damage to their reputation, given the damage to their image, given what is a terrible calamity right now in Yemen, where you're talking about 14 million people on the verge of starvation, they need to take a visible step that shows they're trying to deal with this, but ultimately they can't do it alone. I would also like to see the United States basically go to the King and MBS and say, all right, we're going to settle this issue with Qatar now. We will make a proposal. It'll take into account what is, in fact, in our mutual interest to be sure that the Qataris aren't playing a double game. But the proposal we make, we expect that you will accept, and frankly, we also expect that the Qataris will accept. Lastly, I mean, it might be good to have an empowered ambassador in Saudi Arabia so that you could actually have conversations on a kind of systematic basis. But I guess at this point, I would like to also see what I would call an empowered no surprises channel that we would create. It's not in place of an ambassador because we should have an ambassador there, but I would like to see what would be a kind of senior channel that would basically be a no surprises channel so that this becomes a vehicle in and of itself to be sure that more considered policies take place. I mean, imagine if we'd had such a channel. Would the approach to Qatar have been different? Certainly, we would have been in a position to say, look, we share the same objective, but let us work this. would what was done with Prime Minister Hariri have been done? We might have again said, all right, look, we share the same objective. We don't want to see Hezbollah with a stranglehold. We don't want to be enabling that, but let's see what we can do. And obviously, I think the response to Canada might well have been different. The point is, this is the kind of thing, I don't know that, I mean, Chaz was raising this, I don't know that the U.S. can impose from the outside some kind of check and balance system within Saudi Arabia. I kind of think that's not likely, but I do think that what we can do is establish this. Yes, we have an interest in Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia also has a big interest in us. They have historically looked at us as being the guarantor of their security. And I think the mutuality of those interests are important to maintain, and this kind of a senior level, no surprises channel might be an effective way to do it. These examples, I mean, there are others I could give. As I said, they're designed to affect and change the behavior so it becomes more considered and more predictable on the part of the Saudi leadership.
Well, thank you very much, Dennis. And I mean, as for a senior diplomat geared to have a no-holds-barred access, well, you two guys are interested in this job? Dennis, you've all done it before.
I've already given my life to the country.
So let me, that was really excellent. So let me just ask the first question, then open it up and let me know when I have a moment to take your names down so that I get it all right. Could both of you say a little more about Turkey? You started off with discussing Turkey, Chaz, and Dennis, you alluded to it, but I think it would be interesting to think through a little more what the Turks want out of this. Must be a golden opportunity for Turkey. And we had a session here about 3 or 4 weeks ago where the issue of Turkey's debt problem and its strained relationship with European banks all were affecting the way that Mr. Erdogan was looking at Europe once more. How do you think Erdogan sees this event as serving Turkish interests, and what do you think is on his plate, given that he's not exactly crazy? Chaz?
Well, I think he may be off his meds, but he's not crazy. There is, of course, a long history of Saudi Ottoman and Saudi Turkish rivalry within the realm of Islam, and that is part of this. There is a fundamental split in the Islamic world, with Turkey and Qatar on one side, and Saudi Arabia and some others, the UAE, on the other. Egypt is part of the other, in the sense that Turkey represents Islamist democracy, something that some people say is impossible, just as they used to say the Christian democratic parties in Europe were impossible, given the autocracy of the Roman Catholic Church, and they turned out to be wrong. You have Turkey and Qatar aligned with a democratic Islamism represented by the Muslim Brotherhood, which is absolutely anathema to Saudi Arabia, UAE, and the generals in charge of Egypt. I'm not going to say that the Muslim Brotherhood, when it was the government of Egypt, distinguished itself with its competence, because it demonstrated conclusively that it was not prepared to govern. But the fact is that it does represent an electorally based aspiration for power. And when you talk to groups like Hamas, as I have done, which are allied to the Muslim Brotherhood, you will find that they understand very well the need to alternate in and out of office and the importance of elections. That is why Saudis, Emiratis, and so on despise them. Because their essential message is, in the past, if you had a moral agenda of some sort in the Arab world, you had to ally yourself with a dictator, a thug, a prince, a general, some sort of person who had a great deal of power and was quite ruthless. And they say, no, 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 we can get our power from the ballot box. And that is a direct threat to the very foundations of the traditional monarchies and the Egyptian military-governed state. So there's an ideological element here that's very large and not unimportant. And there are also, of course, geopolitical concerns. Turkey, for various reasons, is drawing closer to Iran. Saudi Arabia, for various reasons, has done the opposite. And they find themselves on opposite sides in places like Syria. So there is a geopolitical game going on here. But it's quite striking that you have Israel and Egypt aligned with Saudi Arabia after the Khashoggi affair, and you have Turkey and Qatar against them. Last point on Turkey. There are rumors, and it's probably very true, that when Mohammed bin Salman talked to Erdogan, that the two of them explored the possibility of a deal on Qatar as a way of ending the torture of Saudi Arabia by Turkey. My own guess is that Turkey's not going to want to give up the cards it holds. So this will be a hard deal to make. But let's remember now that in addition to the United States as an actor, we have the Turks as an actor who are within the region, who are very influential. We also have the Russians, who are everybody's go-to guys on mediation these days. So this brings me finally to the issue of Yemen, if I might. Perhaps I'm overly cynical, but I think it's far too politically convenient for the administration suddenly to start calling for an end to the war in Yemen. That appeals to the opponents of Saudi Arabia. Oh, look, we're listening to you, we're doing something. It is a diversion of attention from MBS. It also underscores the need to keep MBS in there and engaged. So it's a flanking maneuver, it's a distraction, and I think it's about as real as the caravan that's about to attack us on the southern border and related to the same electoral phenomenon. But as I say, I may be too cynical. I suspect Qatar's in that package also. We should restore diplomacy. It would be a great idea to have an ambassador in Riyadh. If we did, and he or she was any good, they would have the role of counselor to the king and crown prince as well as to their own government. And they would be the ones who could convey the very sensible messages that Dennis outlined. However, we're not going to have an ambassador there because a nomination of an ambassador would open this issue up to the Senate and grandstanding in a very political season. So we're hung by our own petard. We don't have an ambassador in Turkey either, by the way. Another problem. And we certainly don't have an ambassador in Iran. And Iran has a vote on Yemen. So if you want to solve Yemen and you don't want to talk to or cooperate with Iran, forget it. They may not have been there at the outset, but they're there now. So I think we have fouled our own nest pretty badly.
Thank you very much. Chaz, Dennis?
Look, I think what Chaz said about the competition between Turkey and Saudi Arabia is right. This was, for Erdogan, this is a golden opportunity, and he's not going to give it up easily. Is he willing to do some kind of deal? You know, you were touching, Jeff, on the financial straits of Turkey. The answer may be, if he gets the right kind of financial package from the Saudis, maybe he makes a deal. What I see is he's not willing to give up the card yet, either because of what he's being offered isn't sufficient, or because he feels, and these are not mutually exclusive, it could be and/or, because he feels this is just kind of the gift that keeps on giving. And particularly because the Saudis don't have, you know, he can keep dribbling things out, and their own story is one that remains either shifting or unclear. So, I mean, I don't see it going away anytime soon. I would add one point just on what Jess said about Yemen and his being cynical. I think there's another reason why the administration may be saying what they're saying on Yemen. They're facing very significant bipartisan opposition on the Hill that began with Yemen and is now carrying over because of the Khashoggi affair. I think the administration realizes that if it doesn't do something, doesn't show that it's doing something, Congress is going to act in a way that's going to tie its hands on the relationship with the Saudis. So I think here you're seeing an example of the administration trying to get out in front of the Congress and show that they're being responsive to a concern.
Okay, thank you both very much.
I agree with that.
So, okay, consensus here. So, who will ask the first question? This I cannot believe. Yes, Bud McFarlane.
No, it's Doyle McManus.
Oh, Doyle, sorry, Doyle, I didn't see you. But,
All right.
Go, Bud go first, Doyle second. You put your hands up if you want to be recognized.
Sorry, Bud.
All right, Doyle, it's
Oh,
you.
I'm sorry. I was happy to defer to Colonel McFarlane, but I'll go ahead. Two questions. First, both of you diplomatically said one of the first questions that must be answered was whether this was a rogue operation or was it directed. And of course, as you know, the conventional wisdom has settled around the notion that 15 agents of Saudi security, including members of the Crown Prince's own bodyguard, all well organized, couldn't have gotten there on a rogue operation. So I want to give you an opportunity to defend that proposition if you really believe in it. My larger question is this. As you also know, there's a school of thought all around the region that we've learned that the Crown Prince is a dangerous hothead. It's not just this, it's Hariri, it's Canada, it's the Ritz-Carlton, it's a long list. And that makes other countries afraid of a Saudi Arabia whose new leadership may not be stabilizing, but rather destabilizing. To what extent is that causing the other countries in the region that we were counting on as part of a notional coalition against Iran, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, I'll leave aside the Emirates, assuming they're still in the notional coalition. To what extent does that cause them to hedge until they are sure they are happy getting into bed or staying in the bed they're already in with Saudi Arabia?
Who would you like to get first? Dennis? Sure.
Look, on the first part of the question, is it conceivable to me that this group went there without an order to go to Turkey from MBS, who controls every instrumentality of power right now? It is not conceivable to me that they went without an order. What is not clear in my own mind was the order to go and kill him, or was the order to either in a mafia-style way say you're not going to say anything anymore, or else, or we're giving you a choice to come back to Saudi Arabia or to be silent, and that those who went felt, not that this was suddenly an unexpected struggle, but those who went felt that if he didn't respond, they could do whatever they wanted. So is that conceivable to me? Yeah, it's conceivable to me. But since that's the case, one of the things that it would be good to see MBS do would be to come out and say, I feel responsible for this. I didn't order a killing. I'm appalled by it. I did order a group to go there and try to persuade him to come back. This went terribly wrong, and I created perhaps a climate in which those who represented me could do something like this, and that's going to change. So would I like to see something like that? Yes, I'm not holding my breath that I'm going to see that happen, but that's what I would like to see happen. On the second question, Bahrain is not going to have a separate policy from Saudi Arabia vis-a-vis Iran. Kuwait will try to be somewhat more balanced, but they'll still be closer to the Saudis than they will be to the Iranians. Qatar is obviously a different story, but I was suggesting this is an area where we need to resolve that. So I don't, when I look at the lineup in the region and their perception of Iran and what Iran is doing, I don't see them somehow saying, gee, we have to create a distance from Saudi Arabia, given the leadership now. I don't see that.
Let me add just a couple of comments. I don't have any doubt that this was a rogue operation. The question is, who was the rogue, not whether it was a rogue operation. Dennis's explanation would do very well as a cover-up. It might also be true. And his suggestion that the Crown Prince step up and accept appropriate responsibility is probably the only way this will be put in a box.
I think.
So that's good. As far as anti-Iranian coalitions are concerned, we're dealing with a part of the world in which, well, I'll put it this way, every country has a national sport that somehow epitomizes its strategic doctrine. So, you know, Europeans have, the Brits have cricket, which only they can understand. It goes on forever, and people in the continent have football, which is a very fluid game with very little strategy and a great deal of tactical brilliance. And we have American football and baseball, in which a few moves occur and then they're not connected to the next moves. And we're brilliant at responding to things. Well, in the Gulf, in the Arab Gulf, the national sport is professional wrestling, where you hire someone to fake a fight for you, or to actually carry out a fight, but you don't get yourself into it. So I would not put too much weight on regional coalitions against Iran. I think people in the Gulf would be very happy to fight Iran to the last American or Israeli, but are not likely to volunteer themselves. Final note, Mr. Netanyahu has just followed Yitzhak Rabin to Muscat in Oman. Oman has played a signal role in brokering contact with Iran in a number of contexts. One has to assume that with the JCPOA probably falling apart, Israel will want to have a better channel of communication to Iran. Oman may provide that. Therefore, this whole equation may take another sudden turn of an unexpected nature. By the way, Oman is not in particularly good graces in Riyadh. It never has been. So this is, in a way, something outside the Khashoggi matter, but it's something to watch.
Just 2 points, then I go to you, but I mean, don't you believe that the simplest thing that the Crown Prince could do is tell us where the body is? I mean, he must presumably know what happened to it. And until we know that answer...
I don't think
you saw the news today, right?
What?
You saw the breaking news from earlier
No,
today?
I didn't.
Apparently, people are saying they think it was dissolved in acid.
Well, he could
Yeah,
say
right.
that. He could say that.
But I think but Jeff, I think it is not necessarily the case that the Crown Prince would know. The question is, did the Crown Prince say, "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest"? And then, you know, people went out and did it from the Royal Guard.
Okay.
Or did he provide precise instructions?
He took the
Did he
acid.
micromanage the matter? We don't know.
Okay.
So I wouldn't make any assumptions about what he knew or didn't know, and what his role was or wasn't. One thing I will say on this is that since 2015, when King Salman succeeded King Abdullah, the whole Saudi constitutional order has been contracted. The former system, which was slow and consultative, has now been replaced by one that is focused on one individual who holds all the reins of power. And the vulnerability of this is obvious. A table with 28 legs is much harder to turn over than one that's got a pedestal. By altering the constitutional order in the way that he has, King Salman and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman have introduced a certain measure of fragility to their system that was not there before.
I mean, just one other quick comment. You mentioned cricket. Actually, the two most fanatical cricket countries in the world are India and Pakistan, and look where it's got them. Bud, you were next. Yes, is there a microphone? Yes, coming.
Thank you both, and Jeff, for this superb analysis of the equities engaged here. The one thing that hasn't come up yet is who wins. Before the murder, Russia was already far along in penetrating the Middle East and Syria, and with its relationship with Iran. China, quite ambitious, one belt, one road, involves the Middle East, significant degree, and China's need for Saudi oil. All of these matters of self-interest for China and Russia would seem to offer opportunities at this point to make gains. Their instrument has seemed on the surface to involve introducing nuclear power generation. And on the Arab side, there is an obvious reaction to the JCPOA, and however that survives or doesn't, having an equivalent capability as well, along with competition being invited, launched by Saudi Arabia. If not that, what? How do you see Chinese and Russian interests being advanced in the wake of this crisis?
Let me start on that. I mentioned arms sales and security equipment sales to Saudi Arabia, in part because these are the subject of proposals for embargo here. Sorry, I'm going to cramp in my leg. The one clear loser from all this is probably the American military-industrial complex, because the placing in jeopardy of this relationship, the uncertainties that have been introduced, will fuel a renewed drive by Riyadh to diversify its own sources of weaponry. There's already a target of having 50% of content of weaponry made in the kingdom by 2030. And the Saudis are very vigorously pursuing that objective. The Chinese and the Russians have had a hard time selling in the Saudi market, partly because of residual suspicions of atheism in the case of the Chinese, partly because of historical antipathies between the Russians and the Russian posture on Islamic minorities in the Russian Federation in that case. I think it's going to get a lot easier for them. And I note that both are now willing for the first time to do significant transfers of manufacturing capacity. In fact, the first major deal the Chinese did was a $10 billion deal to produce lethal drones in Saudi Arabia, and they are actually being produced. The Russians are very likely to sell the S-400 and may be willing to manufacture part of that in the kingdom. So this has been a captive market for the United States. I don't think it's going to be for that much longer. And by the way, there have been times in the past when we've lost that market through neglect. That was the case in the mid-late 80s when the dominant vendors were British, French, and Chinese. That is one clear loser. I would say the U.S. nuclear industry, to the extent that it thought about selling reactors in the region, is probably out of the game now because of the highly politicized nature of such transactions. And I think, in a sense, the necessary diminution of American influence. We've never had control in Saudi Arabia. That's a myth. But we've had influence. We've had a measure of deference. The reduction of this will make the place a little more difficult for Israel to manage because we've always exercised our influence in a way that took Israeli interests very much into account up front. So what further gains and losses there are in the region, it's hard to say. Iran certainly will be pleased by the difficulty that its strategic opponent is now in, unless they follow Dennis's advice and wriggle out of the problem forthrightly. This is going to go on for a while, and it will not do any good to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
I think it's, look, on the one hand, the Russians have clearly established themselves increasingly as an arbiter in the region. One of their objectives was absolutely to establish themselves as the arbiter of the future of Syria, and we pretty much opted out of that, so we've left that pretty much open to them. I do think that sends a message to others who have always relied upon the United States as being the ultimate kind of guarantor of their security. I suspect they are, the Saudis in particular, still, by dint of instinct and habit, would be inclined to rely upon us. They may have more doubts about that. I don't think they really want to see an end to the security relationship with the United States, because I think they still count on that being very important to them. And when they look at the Russians, I don't think they see the Russians as being a source of their security. The Chinese, they understand, are more mercantilist in terms of how they approach things, so they're not a source of their security. So there's a desire, I think, to want to preserve the relationship, even, Chaz said, even though they want to diversify arms, for sure they do, for a lot of different reasons, but part of that is built into the National Transformation Plan and Vision 2030 about the transformation of Saudi Arabia itself, and the belief that the military industry can be something that is also part of their development and growth. But I don't really see them wanting to see the relationship turn in a very different way. Chaz is quite right on the nuclear issue. I think it's going to be very hard now, given the mood on the Hill, for the U.S. to be a player in what the Saudis seem to want to be part of their energy future, which is nuclear power. I do think it's in our interest to be a player in that, because I don't think anybody else is going to be as committed to ensuring that there isn't local enrichment. And I'm concerned that, in fact, that's where we could be headed. So if the U.S. isn't a player on nuclear power in Saudi Arabia, I think the risk of proliferation in the region goes up. So I still see that as an American national security interest. In the near term, I think it's going to be difficult to manage, given, as I said, what the mood on the Hill is, which is not a reason not to make the effort.
Let me make one brief observation. I agree completely. The Saudis do not want to sever relations with the United States. They want to retain as much American support as they can have. And each of the alternatives to the United States presents problems. The Russians have a regional agenda in Syria and with regard to Iran that is quite different from the Saudis, and therefore not trustworthy in geopolitical terms, quite aside what you may think about their history and their treatment of Muslim minorities. The Chinese, I wouldn't say are mercantilist, I think that's us these days. But I would say that they're not into government-managed trade and bilateral trade balances and so forth, which is the definition of mercantilism. But they are very much interested in not getting embroiled in other people's quarrels. They want to stay as aloof as they can. You know, they are the modern embodiment of the early American Republic, no entangling alliances, and for the same reason. And it's not a bad strategy. They look at alliances, ententes perhaps, because they have no allies, and see them as liabilities. If you sign up with this other country, they may blunder into war and you may have to go with them. So they don't see things in the way that we do, and they will remain as aloof as they can do. I don't know what Mr. Bolsonaro will do now that he's in charge of Brazil. The Brazilians have been players in the arms market in the past, but I don't think they present any kind of alternative to the United States. And Europe is too divided and confused about issues like those we've been talking about to really be an effective force at present. It's trying to become one. Hope springs eternal. It may happen, but not in my lifetime, I'm afraid.
We'll try. Just for the record, Chaz, remind me, but I believe it was the United States refusal to upgrade the F-15s we were selling to Saudi Arabia with conformal fuel tanks, which would have extended their range to hit Israel, that led to the Chinese missile deal.
Not exactly. There was something called the War of the Cities going on between Iran and Iraq, and 800 Iranian Scuds hit Baghdad during that period, causing huge damage. And the Iranians obviously had the capacity to attack Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis wanted a counter-battery capability, the ability to fire back. So they came here and asked for a denuclearized version of the Pershing, and were laughed out of town. We were thinking about Israel, they weren't. Prince Bandar then flew in short order to London, where he did the Al Yamama deal with Margaret Thatcher, and onward to Beijing, where he bought Dongfeng 3 missiles, CSS-2s, in the NATO designation. So the F-15 was not really the precipitating issue. It was more the War of the Cities.
Interesting, interesting. Now,
Hi, Kelly Torrance, The Weekly Standard. Of course, MBS did a bit of a Western, PR tour, which seemed to be relatively successful. He seemed to be sort of, modeling himself perhaps on other Middle Eastern politicians who've done similar. But unlike Javad Zarif, MBS has no education in the West. He was educated entirely in Saudi Arabia, and I wonder. Reading about everything that happened, you sort of wonder, did he really not think that the West was just going to ignore this murder and the way it was conducted? And I wonder, I'm curious, do you think that the fact that he does not have a Western education makes him a little more clueless on Western norms, or does he think that in this age, as you note, as Ambassador Ross noted, everybody seems to be flouting global norms? Did he think it was just going to be A-okay? And I'm just curious. It's interesting to me that he is one person who doesn't have as much experience with the West as some other Middle Easterns who have used that to their advantage in appealing to Western governments and populations.
Okay, which of you wish to take that question?
Well, I think yes, it's true. He was not educated abroad. But he's far from unsophisticated, as he's shown. I think, every Friday there's a massacre on the Gaza border. Nobody says anything about it. Doesn't even make the front page of the press. So it's entirely possible that he thought, I can get away with this if indeed he thought something as dreadful as what did happen was going to happen. But, more likely, as Dennis speculated, he issued a general order. The rules of engagement were loose, and what happened was not his precise intent. So he never got into thinking about that kind of question. I would just say one other thing. This is the imperial city we're living in. We imagine the world revolves around our feelings and reactions. It doesn't. People are always far more concerned about their domestic politics than they are about distant reactions in strange places where nobody can believe the state of our government at present. I'll just put it that way.
Okay, I've got three people at least there. Wayne, Mary, George Beebe, and Jerry. Okay, so Wayne.
Thank you. Wayne Mary. Regardless of what happens in our politics next Tuesday, one of the things that does seem to unite both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue and political parties is a desire for what we quaintly call regime change in Iran. The debate is over methods and how far we're prepared to go to achieve that. Those who are willing to engage in actual military action against the Islamic Republic almost all see Saudi Arabia as an active participant in that coalition, at least for basing and other purposes. So my question to you, even though it may be somewhat premature, is what impact do you think the Khashoggi affair, and I don't just mean the murder of the individual, but the affair, as you have analyzed it and described it so well, what impact do you think that has on the probability that the United States actually will engage in military action against Iran in the foreseeable future?
I'll start.
Dennis, you go first?
Yeah,
Okay.
Sure.
I think there's a premise to your question that I guess I don't accept. I don't think the administration has the slightest interest in engaging in a military conflict with Iran. I think this is a president who has an approach that's defined by maximum pressure, but maximum pressure is through economic means. I think he feels that it worked with North Korea. You can debate whether it worked, but clearly it's had some effect because they suspended their warhead and ICBM testing. Yeah, there were verbal threats, but I don't think when he looks at the Middle East and he keeps talking about we've spent $7 trillion in wars in the Middle East, those aren't the words of someone who's looking for, I think, another military conflict, number one. Number two, go back and look what he said when he withdrew from the JCPOA. When he withdrew, he said, I understand the Iranians are saying they won't negotiate now. If I were in their position, I would be saying the same thing. But when they're ready, I will be ready, willing, and able. He sees himself as a deal maker, and he sees the way to get to a deal is through maximum pressure. So the idea that they're positioning themselves to go to a war with Iran, I don't see it. It's clearly not something that our military is enthusiastic about. They're doing much more planning to sort of deal with Russia and China. We have withdrawn an aircraft carrier from the Persian Gulf. By the way, we closed down our consulate in Basra. These are signals that aren't exactly the ones you would send if you were trying to build military pressure or convey staying power to the Iranians. So I think we will continue to pursue a maximum pressure approach that is largely driven by economic terms. I just don't see it as being driven by a military approach.
Yes, so you agree?
I agree we want regime change on the cheap, yes. We don't want any sacrifices on our part to achieve it. So the assumption seems to be that Iran will somehow fall apart under the pressure of sanctions, that there will be an upswell of nationalist embrace of our cause. There will be dancing and flowers in the streets. We might have heard that before. And I don't believe any of that, but I agree with Dennis. Nobody really, on our side, nobody really wants a war.
George? Yeah.
Thanks, George Beebe. I think I'd like to hear more about the relationship between the Khashoggi assassination and internal reform in Saudi Arabia. Generally, I think Americans tend to think in broad categories of good guys and bad guys when we look abroad. Someone is a good guy, in which case he does good things inside and outside his country, or he's a bad guy, and if he does something bad outside his country, that's a sign that he also has ill intent inside. It didn't strike me in listening to your presentations that either one of you accept that premise. You seem to be saying, hey, MBS is doing some reckless and counterproductive things abroad, but that should not change our perceptions about what his intentions are inside Saudi Arabia. If that's in fact what you're thinking, can you expand a little bit on why it is that you believe that to be the case?
I think Jamal Khashoggi was a complex human being who embraced contradictions, as we all do. He was quite realistic about many things. He was a patriot. He was concerned about precisely the constitutional change in Saudi Arabia that I outlined. He was sympathetic to the idea of a more open and consultative society, and he saw his country going in the opposite direction. Didn't like it. As for MBS, he too has his complexities. He has used the power he's accrued within the kingdom to very good effect in terms of pushing forward reforms that have been talked about for a long time, but where there was never a consensus such that under the previous system of governance, a decision could be made. During my tenure in Riyadh, which was Desert Shield, Desert Storm, a quiet time, the king repeatedly steeled himself, for example, to deal with the issue of women driving. And it always seemed to be imminent. I had an understanding with a Saudi business friend that if it ever happened, the two of us would build a separate road system that would be required. But then, whenever he would be on the brink of making the decision, some group of women would go out and drive and make a ruckus, and the religious establishment would go on a warpath, and consensus would fall apart, and nothing would be decided. MBS has the merit of cutting Gordian knots. In the process, he makes a lot of enemies. He also acquires a lot of admirers. And as I say, the table is now on a pedestal, not on 28 legs. So what he is able to do domestically, because he is decisive and autocratic, he's also able to do externally. And his decision-making in that realm has been less convincingly wise. The war in Yemen is a classic example of a war begun with no war termination strategy, no concept of how to end it. It is therefore an abuse of the use of force, in my opinion, as a diplomat. I have nothing against starting wars. I've been in a few, but I don't think you start a war lightly. I think you need to know how it's going to end and why the other side should accept the terms that you're proposing, and what it is that you will have accomplished that will justify ending the fighting. None of that was apparent in Yemen. The blockade of Qatar is more an old family quarrel than anything else, although there is this ideological overlay that I mentioned. So he's been very successful domestically. He's gotten the kingdom into a bit of difficulty abroad. And the interesting thing about the Khashoggi affair is that it happened abroad. And it is not an example, whatever else it may be, of wise planning and competent execution.
Anything to add, Dennis?
I do. He believes that the only way to produce the change that is necessary in Saudi Arabia is to carry out a revolution from above. He has said that Saudi Arabia has to diversify its economy for its own future, for its own sake. And I would say, without, he hasn't said this explicitly, but it's implicit, for the survival of the royal family and the royal family's rule. He has said that for 30 years we've talked about diversifying the economy and we've never done it. And he has this view that that oil is a diminishing asset for Saudi Arabia because he looks at renewables, he looks at shale, he looks at electric cars, And he sees that over time, their oil may be worth less, and that they, at the same time, they have this burgeoning population. 70% of the population is under the age of 30. And this was a combustible mixture from his standpoint. He obviously watched what happened in 2011, and he drew a set of conclusions from that if Saudi Arabia didn't change on the inside, the royal family rule might not survive. And he understood to make these kinds of changes, they had to be social and economic. That meant he had to take on the religious establishment. So he's taking on the religious establishment, he's taking on significant parts of the royal family, meaning he faced real opposition, and he has pushed ahead with this kind of objective in mind. His objectives are very ambitious, they're hard to achieve. He's got to change and overhaul the educational system, he's got to change work habits, he's got to change cultural and social mores. All of this takes a major effort, and it comes from above. Now, what I think has contributed to where the problem is that he sees the opposition, and therefore he says, I won't brook any dissent, because dissent will be designed to undercut what I'm doing. And here's where there's a need for some balance, and here's where there's a need for checks and balance and some consideration of the policies. So, as Chaz said, when you're not checked at all, and when you control every instrumentality of power, and you don't seem to have people around you who can say no to you, well, then you end up seeing some of what we've seen on the outside. On the inside, what he's trying to do, I think, ultimately, it doesn't just serve Saudi's interests, it serves ours as well. But the question is, if you cross these kinds of lines, sooner or later you're going to cross them in a way on the inside too, which will be self-defeating to your own objectives.
Which is why counsel is an important role for the United States. And severing relationships is not a wise course.
Dario, the final question?
Thanks, Jeff. I wanted to come back, and both of you at one point or another have talked about the issue of the convergence of U.S. and Saudi interests. And certainly, as we look back over the last 75 years, that has been a major pillar of our whole policy in the Middle East. But I'd like to ask you whether you think that common interest still exists, and going forward, and if you go back, if you look at 2003 as kind of the high point of U.S.-Saudi agreement, and everything that happened from the invasion of Iraq on is kind of one step after another. The JCPOA, the whole issue of where Obama was on Iran versus Saudi Arabia, the increasing independence of Saudi and Emirati decision-making on issues like Egypt, a reaction to the Arab Spring, and you can go on, Qatar being another example. I actually don't think that Yemen was an area of divergent interest. I think that our interests were the same. But you know, and also declining confidence, and I think that you both talked about it, declining confidence in the credibility of U.S. guarantees to Saudi Arabia, U.S. staying power in the region. Do you see that the future of U.S.-Saudi relations is going to be on the same fundamental basis and the same understanding that stability and security are the two things that really bind our societies together in the region?
Okay. I would say the basic interests have not changed, but the intensity of the bonds that they create has been diluted or tempered. Saudi Arabia is still very important to the global economy, and the United States needs to be able to have our views taken into account when the Saudis make policy, whether it's on currencies or oil supply or nuclear matters. I agree with Dennis. That is all important. Saudi Arabia is the custodian of the two holy mosques. It has had a certain moral standing in the Islamic world. It's not always accepted. It's quite controversial. But historically, it has acted more often than not, as our lawyer, to coin a phrase, in the Islamic world. That's important. The intelligence cooperation we have is important. The ability of the Saudis to put up money in support of common causes. You know, in 1987, the peak year of U.S.-China cooperation in Afghanistan, there was $830 million spent on Chinese weaponry by my former embassy. It was Saudi money. You know, huge purchases of stuff to knock down the Russian Empire. I think that opportunity is still there if we find common causes. But, of course, the Cold War framework is gone. There is no automatic mise en place for the meal. And so I think, finally, Saudi Arabia is not going to cease to be an important market for the United States, even if others gain at our expenses. I expect they will. So the basic interests are there, but they're less intense. And they're more subject to attack by others. We still need each other, perhaps not as much.
Last word, Dennis.
You know, I generally agree with that. I think what is required, what we've seen is there's a much deeper need for managing the relationship. You know, there is a danger that it goes off the rails if you see certain kinds of behaviors that make it harder to sustain our position here. I mean, that again is the congressional attitudes that have emerged. You know, they're quite genuine, and they reflect really sincere kinds of concerns. It's not something where people are playing politics. This is actually one of the few issues right now where there's a bipartisan approach. So, if nothing else, it requires, I think, management on our part, more explanation of why the relationship is important, but also understandings with the Saudis on do's and don'ts. No doubt they will want to hear some do's and don'ts from us as well. I mean, a real no surprises channel should be a two-way street. But I think what the murder of Khashoggi highlights a fundamental difference with a country that people had felt, okay, this is a country with whom we share basic strategic interests. And so what it did is it crystallized a sense of real difference. We want the Saudis to understand and MBS to understand why. And we also need, I think, to use our role and influence to try to channel their behaviors in a more constructive way, because, as I think both of us said, it's not just that we have these common interests with them that are not going to disappear. We really do have a very strong stake in the success of Saudi transformation. The reasons for it, I think the analytical reasons that MBS understood for why there needed to be change were right. He never intended political change. He intended social and economic change. And again, that doesn't mean that we share values, but we certainly share very strong interests.
So there is a footnote to that, and that is that which I agree with. There is great confusion under the heavens in North America. The American people and the Congress have not internalized the indifference of the Trump administration to human rights and democracy promotion. And you can see this in the case of China, where also there was a social and economic revolution without a political chain Americanization. So we have a particular difficulty in dealing with this because of our own schizophrenia, not to put too fine a word on it.
Look, thank you so much. You agree this was an excellent sort of session, and thanks to Dennis and to Chaz. Thank you. Excellent.